So, free to choose or capitalism and freedom, those are the two. If he had to choose, what were the two of his, what he thought was his most important books? It would be between Free to Choose and this one, Capitalism and Freedom. Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman. So page 7, chapter 1, the relation between economic freedom and political freedom. It is widely believed that politics and economics are separate and largely unconnected, that individual freedom is a political problem and material welfare an economic problem, and that any kind of political arrangements can be combined with any kind of economic arrangements. The chief contemporary manifestation of this idea is the advocacy of democratic socialism, in quotations. So that's Milton Friedman warning us about the evils, the travails of democratic socialism. See what's going on YouTube, the Bituation Podcast, If Names Were Farts, Key and Peele, America's Secret Government, RT America, Clint Eastwood on The Tonight Show, Bill Burr loses his sponsors, Wu-Tang Collection, Ninja, Ultimate Challenge, Dr. Dre, Still Dre, Piano Solo. That's interesting. We'll get back to that in a second. Chapter 1, the relation between economic freedom and political freedom. It's widely believed that politics and economics are separate, largely unconnected, that individual freedom is a political problem and material welfare an economic problem, and that any kind of political arrangements can be combined with any kind of economic arrangements. The chief contemporary manifestation of this idea is the advocacy of democratic socialism by many who condemn out of hand the restrictions on individual freedom imposed by totalitarian socialism in Russia, and who are persuaded that it is possible for a country to adopt the essential free features of Russian economic arrangements and yet to ensure individual freedom through political arrangements. The thesis of this chapter is that such a view is a delusion, that there's an intimate connection between economics and politics, that only certain combinations of political and economic arrangements are even possible, that in particular a society which is socialist cannot also be democratic in the sense of guaranteeing individual freedom. Economic arrangements play a dual role in the promotion of a free society. On the one hand, freedom in economic arrangements is itself a component of freedom broadly understood. So economic freedom is an end in itself. In the second place, economic freedom is also an indispensable means toward the achievement of political freedom. The first of these roles of economic freedom needs special emphasis because intellectuals in particular have a strong bias against regarding this aspect of freedom as important. They tend to express contempt for what they regard as material aspects of life and to regard their own pursuit of alleged higher values as on a different plane of significance and as deserving of special attention. For most citizens of the country, however, if not for the intellectual, the direct importance of economic freedom is at least comparable in its significance to the indirect importance of economic freedom as a means to political freedom. The citizen of Great Britain who after World War II was not permitted to spend his vacation in the United States because of exchange control was being deprived of an essential freedom, no less than the citizen of the United States who was denied the opportunity to spend his vacation in Russia because of his political views. The one was ostensibly an economic limitation on freedom and the other a political limitation, yet there is no essential difference between the two. The citizen of the United States who is compelled by law to devote something like 10% of his income to the purchase of a particular kind of retirement contract administered by the government is being deprived of a corresponding part of his personal freedom. How strongly this deprivation may be felt in its closeness to the deprivation of religious freedom, which all would regard as civil or political rather than economic, were dramatized by an episode involving a group of farmers of the Amish sect. On the grounds of principle, this group regarded compulsory federal old age programs as an infringement of their personal individual freedom, refused to pay taxes or accept benefits. As a result, some of their livestock were sold at auction in order to satisfy claims for Social Security levies. True, the number of citizens who regard compulsory old age insurance as a deprivation of freedom may be few, but the believer in freedom has never counted noses. A citizen of the United States who, under the laws of various states, is not free to follow the occupation of his own choosing unless he can get a license for it, is likewise being deprived of an essential part of his freedom. So is the man who would like to exchange some of his goods with, say, a Swiss for a watch, but is prevented from doing so by a quota. So also is the Californian who is thrown into jail for selling Alka-Seltzer at a price below that set by the manufacturer under so-called fair trade laws. So also is the farmer who cannot grow the amount of wheat he wants, and so on. Clearly, economic freedom in and of itself is an extremely important part of total freedom. Viewed as a means to the end of political freedom, economic arrangements are important because of their effect on the concentration or dispersion of power. The kind of economic organization that provides economic freedom directly, namely competitive capitalism, also promotes political freedom because it separates economic power from political power, and in this way enables the one to offset the other. Historical evidence speaks with a single voice on the relation between political freedom and a free market. I know of no example in time or place of a society that has been marked by a large measure of political freedom, and that has not also used something comparable to a free market to organize the bulk of economic activity. Because we live in a largely free society, we tend to forget how limited is the span of time in the part of the globe for which there has ever been anything like political freedom. The 19th century and early 20th century in the Western world stand out as striking exceptions to the general trend of historical development. Political freedom, in this instance, clearly came along with the free market and the development of capitalist institutions. So also did political freedom in the golden age of Greece and in the early days of the Roman era. History suggests only that capitalism is a necessary condition for political freedom. Clearly, it's not a sufficient condition. Fascist Italy, fascist Spain, Germany at various times in the last 70 years, Japan before World War I and II, Tsarist Russia in the decades before World War I, are all societies that cannot conceivably be described as politically free, yet in each private enterprise was the dominant form of economic organization. It is therefore clearly possible to have economic arrangements that are fundamentally capitalist and political arrangements that are not free. Even in those societies, the citizenry had a good deal more freedom than citizens of a modern totalitarian state like Russia or Nazi Germany, in which economic totalitarianism is combined with political totalitarianism. Even in Russia, under the Tsars, it was possible for some citizens, under some circumstances, to change their jobs without getting permission from political authority, because capitalism and the existence of private property provided some check to the centralized power of the state. The relation between political and economic freedom is complex and by no means unilateral. In the early 19th century, Bentham and the philosophical radicals were inclined to regard political freedom as a means to economic freedom. They believed that the masses were being hampered by the restrictions that were being imposed upon them, that if political reform gave the bulk of the people the vote, they would do what was good for them, which was to vote for laissez-faire. In retrospect, one cannot say that they were wrong. There was a large measure of political reform that was accompanied by economic reform in the direction of a great deal of laissez-faire. An enormous increase in the well-being of the masses followed this change in economic arrangements. The triumph of Benthamite liberalism in 19th century England was followed by a reaction toward increase in intervention by government in economic affairs. This tendency to collectivism was greatly accelerated both in England and elsewhere by the two world wars. Welfare, rather than freedom, became the dominant note in democratic countries, recognizing the implicit threat to individualism. The intellectual descendants of the philosophical radicals, Dicey, Mises, Hayek, and Simons, to mention only a few, feared that a continued move towards centralized control of economic activity would prove the road to serfdom. As Hayek entitled his penetrating analysis of the process, their emphasis was on economic freedom as a means towards political freedom. Okay, on and on and on. Shut the fuck up, Milton Friedman. Let's listen to Adam Smith. You get 3 sentences, page 438. The annual produce of the land and labor of any nation can be increased in its value by no other means but by increasing either the number of its productive laborers or the productive powers of those laborers who had before been employed. The number of its productive laborers, it is evident, can never be much increased, but in consequence of an increase of capital or of funds destined for maintaining them, the productive power of the same number of laborers cannot be increased, but in consequence either of some addition and improvement to those machines and instruments which facilitate and abridge labor, or of a more proper division and distribution of employment.